Welcome to the Evangelism Training Podcast. I'm so excited to be joined today by Dr. Randy Newman. Randy Newman is the author and is a senior fellow of apologetics and evangelism at the C.S. Lewis Institute. He has taught at several evangelical seminaries. I would like to think most notably Trinity, but I'm biased. After serving for over 30 years with Campus Crusade for Christ, he established Connection Points, a ministry to help Christians engage people's hearts the way Jesus did. He has written 6 books: Questioning Evangelism, Corner Conversations, Bringing the Gospel Home, Engaging with Jewish People, Unlikely Converts, and Probable Stories of Faith and What They Teach Us About Evangelism, and his most recent book, and what we'll be talking about today, Mere Evangelism. Dr. Newman has also written numerous articles about evangelism and other ways our lives intertwine with God's creation. He earned his MDiv and a PhD in Intercultural Studies from Trinity International University. I had him for class 10 years ago this week for evangelism at Trinity. There are still things from that class that I use to this day, both in my own approach to evangelism and in my preaching. Dr. Newman, I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to join me today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Josh. Thanks.
The first thing I wanted to ask, and this is something I was thinking about when going through the book, as somebody who loves C.S. Lewis and who enjoys writing, the more I went through the book, the more I thought this seems like such an incredible undertaking to have put this together, because it's both a book obviously about evangelism, but you're also heavily influenced in the book on the thought of C.S. Lewis. And you're also somewhat giving a survey of the works of C.S. Lewis, and also giving various stories and biographical details on Lewis, working those in. And I just thought to myself, this book seems like it would have been so difficult to write.
Well, I think I want to leave you in that belief so that you're really impressed with me. But in reality, I mean, writing any book is a big undertaking. So yeah, it was a difficult project, but not any more than my other books. And the thing is, I've been reading and studying and thinking about and teaching about C.S. Lewis for 40 years. C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity was very important in my coming to faith. So even much longer than 40 years, because I read him when I was, a sophomore in college, so less than 20 years old. And then I've just been reading and studying him for all these years. So in some ways, writing this book was really fun in drawing upon things I've been reading and quoting for 40 years. In a sense, and I've also been doing a lot of teaching about evangelism. So in a sense, it was like taking these two streams that I've thought a great deal about and brought them together. So I'm not saying it was easy, but it was really a very rewarding thing of, like I said, like culminating 40 years of thinking and teaching. It was just a great blending together.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'd be curious, as somebody who has spent many, many years studying C.S. Lewis, for the layperson, I think that there's definitely an understanding of C.S. Lewis and his work as an apologist. But that's, to me, his evangelism and philosophy of evangelism is so much broader than, it's not simply just answering objections that people have. So I'd be curious, in your opinion, what do you think are the biggest 1 or 2 misconceptions that people have about Lewis's approach to evangelism?
Oh, okay. That's not where I thought you were going, but good. Okay, misconceptions people have. Well, I think maybe. Well, let me back up and say I'm not totally sure, but I think the misconceptions people may have about C.S. Lewis, the apologist and the evangelist, is probably also the misconceptions that they have about evangelism in general. And that is that if you just answer a question, then you've done what you need to do. So if somebody has this question, you give this answer. And if they have this question, you give this answer. And it's a you study it like, I don't know, sort of a multiple choice test, or you just, memorize the top 10 questions that people are going to ask and the best ways to answer them, and boom, you've got it. But that's not what Lewis did, and it's not what I think the Bible teaches us to do. It's not the way Jesus interacted with people. So what Lewis did was he engaged with people and got their imaginations going about what it would feel like to become a Christian. He engaged their intellect so that it was a back and forth kind of almost like an out loud argument, but argue sounds so negative, and he did it so very pleasantly. But I think that the biggest thing that made me want to write the book, and what sold it to the people of the Good Book Company who published it, was Lewis, I think, better than anybody else, really understood the way non-Christians thought, because he himself had been a rigorously committed atheist for the first half of his life. So it wasn't that long ago that he had these wrestlings and these questions. And then secondly, he knew you had to back up further and start much further back. He was a genius at what we call pre-evangelism. He knew you don't just start with, let me tell you who Jesus is. At least not with everybody. I mean, with some people you start there, but the vast majority of people in England, when he did those radio broadcasts during World War II, and I think a very high percentage of people that we're likely to meet today, you had to back way up to say, well, how do we know anything? And is there something inside of us that's like an innate sense of right and wrong? If so, where did that come from? And why do we think that there are rules that you shouldn't break? And then after you establish that for a while, then you say, and why is it that we break them? And why do we fall short? So he went way far back further to, how do we know anything? And those are the conversations I think we need to have today, more pre-evangelistic than explicitly evangelistic.
I'm sure pre-evangelism has always had its place. And so for people who feel like they struggle with evangelism or don't know where to begin with evangelism, is something like pre-evangelism something that people need to make more of a focal point in their interactions with people?
Let's see, you started your question with, hasn't pre-evangelism always been a need? And I think the answer is yes. Is it more of a need today in the United States than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago? Yes, very much so. So in a sense, Europe and England has needed it longer than the US has. And so that's why we can learn so much from Lewis in the 1940s through his radio broadcasts that became the book Mere Christianity. But I want your listeners to know, this isn't just C.S. Lewis's idea, and it's certainly not my idea. I think this is what Paul was doing in Acts 17 when he stood up on Mars Hill, the Areopagus, and had this presentation to people that went for a long time before he got anywhere near Jesus. He talked about, look at around you, you have all of these statues and tombs to an unknown God. Now, how do we even know if there is a God? And so he kind of did some very, very basic apologetics for a belief in the existence of God. And he quoted their poets. He looked around in their culture, he quoted their poets and said, now what is it that you people already do believe? Well, let me tell you where that's pointing. So I think what Paul did in Athens is a very good display of what pre-evangelism could look like. But I'll even go further back. I think that's what Jesus was doing when he talked to the woman at the well in John chapter 4. You contrast the way Jesus talked to a very religious man, Nicodemus, in John chapter 3. He didn't do a whole lot of pre-evangelism with Nicodemus. He just dove right in. You must be born again. And then he made his argument to say, listen, you're a teacher of the Jews. You should know this. This shouldn't be a strikingly new concept. You believe the scriptures. And he was pointing to a concept of a new birth that Ezekiel talked about. And he was arguing for principles that were perfectly in line with the Old Testament, what Nicodemus already believed. But in John chapter 4, the very next chapter, when he's talking to the woman at the well, he doesn't start with theology with her. He talks with her about water and thirst. And wouldn't it be great if there was a kind of water that when you drank it, you'd never get thirsty again? Isn't there something inside of us that's yearning for satisfaction? And oh, by the way, you're not going to find it with men. You've had 5 husbands. That hasn't worked out all that well. The guy you're living with now isn't going to work out. So that's pre-evangelism. That's saying we're looking for some kind of connectedness, and we can't find it in another person, no matter how good the relationship is. I mean, we could read that story and go, well, she just, met these 5 lousy guys, and the guy she's now with, she's, this woman's got, emotional problems. No, there's no earthly relationship that totally satisfies. Though earthly relations are a picture, a pointer to a greater intimacy that we're longing for. So what Jesus did in John chapter 4, what Paul did in Acts 17, what Paul did in Acts 14 is another kind of display. I won't go into that now, but I mean, we have these examples of paving the way for a gospel presentation, so that when we make the gospel presentation, it makes sense to people.
Yeah, and that's an important point, that Lewis's evangelism on philosophy and the points that you pull out of Lewis throughout the book, you're also talking about biblical passages where the same things are demonstrated. And so I think that's helpful, that these things are grounded in the Bible and in the ministry of Christ himself and how he interacted with people. Something I've said before at church, Jesus didn't treat people like robots that were all just programmed the exact same way and respond to us all the exact same categorical way. I'd be curious your opinion on, again, things like pre-evangelism, bringing context to people. For so many, that seems to be so counter to their natural approach to evangelism. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it is counter. Well, there's a whole bunch of factors. I don't think I can go into all of them, but here are a couple. The first and the biggest is in our country, in America, there was a very long period of time, I would even say maybe the first 200 years of our existence, when a biblical mindset or a biblical framework about reality was very common. And so for vast periods of time, you could say to somebody, do you know God personally? And they would know what you're talking about. That wouldn't seem crazy to them. And if you said, our sin separates us from God, the vast majority of people go, that's right. I know. Yeah. I mean, I am sinful. And for a long time, you could say to someone, well, let's take a look at something in the Bible. And they would say, that's probably a good place to look. Now, for a whole host of reasons, our culture shifted in rather dramatic ways, so that in the 1990s and in the 2000s, those kind of assumptions weren't held by the majority of people. They had eroded, or other things came in to compete. And so it became where you'd say to someone, would you like to know God personally? And they would say, well, which God do you mean? Which God are you talking about? There's a lot of different gods. In our country itself has become so much more ethnically and nationally diverse. We have people coming from all over the world to move in. That was not always the case. For a very long time, people came from Western Europe. I mean, there was a few other places and stuff, but for the most part, it was a white, Western European mindset coming in. And so there were shared assumptions. So here's the thing: in the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 1970s, with the rise of the Jesus movement, there was tremendous success, if I can use that word, in evangelism. There just was. I mean, Billy Graham held crusades, and thousands of people showed up, and thousands of people walked down the aisle and became Christians. And there's all sorts of success stories. Campus Crusade was started on the college campuses in 1951. And there was great fruitfulness. And so what happened was people said, okay, now we know how to do it. We know how to do evangelism, because look at what worked. 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. But then the culture changed so dramatically, and those methods weren't quite working as well as they used to be. And again, you see it of Paul preached differently in a Jewish synagogue in Acts 13 than he did on Mars Hill in Acts 17. And both of those are different than the way he did things in Acts 14 in Lystra and Derbe, which was very different than either of those two settings. Even the way the four different gospels are written to four different audiences. Matthew appealed to a whole lot of Old Testament prophecy because he was writing to a Jewish audience. Mark appealed to very, very few, if any, of those. So we have right in the scriptures themselves this: when you're talking to a different audience, you need a different approach. It's what Paul said, I became all things to all people so that by all means I might save some. He preached very differently in Corinth than he did in Athens, and he wrote differently to the Colossians than he wrote to the Galatians. And so anyway, so I hope I'm answering your question. I think we need to make adjustments, not changing the content of our message, but changing to be the way we lead into our message and the way we express our message. For the exact same reasons why we translate the Bible into different languages. We don't change the Bible, but if you're trying to speak to someone who doesn't speak English, but you can get a translation of the scriptures in their language, well, why not? I mean, that's the way to go.
Now, if somebody is listening and is thinking, this makes a lot of sense, but they also feel this tension of, that seems like a lot of work. What do you think a good starting point is?
All right. So the first thing I want to say is, trial and error is not that bad. Sure. I think I've learned, I think the vast majority of what I've learned about evangelism is a whole lot of trial and error. In fact, I sometimes tell people, I feel like I've learned, and I'm still learning. I'm still not good at this. I'm learning about evangelism, and I feel like I'm living out the movie Groundhog Day. So I don't know if your listeners know this film. They should. They really should. So it's this guy who keeps reliving the same day over and over and over again. And there's a couple of scenes where he tries something out. Well, that was stupid. That didn't work. So then he comes back the next go through of the same day and then tries something else. And so that's what I feel like. I've talked to somebody, and if they ask me a question, I've given, what I thought was a good answer. That didn't work. Shouldn't have said it that way. All right, the next time I'm going to try coming back at this. So first of all, trial and error is not that bad. But here's the much bigger principle to remember, and that is we step into this whole thing of evangelism with the Lord who does the impossible part of this job, the part that only God can do. He opens blind eyes. He softens hardened hearts. He draws people to himself. He uses us in the process, but the real heavy lifting, if I can put it that way, is the work of the Holy Spirit convicting people of sin and drawing them. So we come in and we ask questions, we try to give answers, we read people Bible verses, we try all sorts of things, but the whole time we're also praying, Lord, would you use this? And I don't know, that I find that to be liberating. Once I remember, okay, I'm not in this alone. If I'm in it alone, it's not going to work. It's just not going to happen. And so so remembering that and asking God to use whatever I say, even bad, stupid stuff. Now, I don't want to encourage bad, stupid stuff, but I almost have this feeling that the Holy Spirit's kind of watching and going, "Oh, I can work with that. That's okay. Wasn't perfect. I would have done it differently, but I can work with this." So I think that's really important to remember. You know, I think there was a long period of time when people in ministry who were trying to train in evangelism, that one of the things they wanted to try to do was to convince people this is not that hard. You can do this. This is not difficult. This is easy. Well, I'm not really sure where those people were living, but they weren't living where I was living. And I had the advantage / disadvantage of being assigned to college campuses that were really, really difficult. I was always on the East Coast in big cities, and things did not work at the campuses where I was the way they worked in the Midwest. No insult to you or your listeners, or the South, the Bible Belt. I mean, there was just a whole lot of stuff that worked in those places that didn't work in Baltimore, and certainly didn't work in Washington, D.C. So at some point I had to say, now, why is this so difficult? And I think I had this turning point in years of ministry of, wait a minute, maybe it is difficult. Maybe it's always going to be difficult. Maybe this is never going to be easy. In fact, maybe it's impossible. Maybe it's absolutely a miracle if anybody ever becomes a Christian. And then I thought, that's true. It is. No one can come to me, Jesus said, unless the Father draws him. That's absolutely supernatural. Paul said that we were all dead in our trespasses and sins, not sick or ignorant. No, we were dead. It's an absolute miracle when God makes people alive, when people are born again. And so if I remember, okay, yeah, this is probably going to be difficult, but it's not too difficult for God. It's going to be difficult for me, but God, would you come in and do the impossible? That I find that to be in an odd way liberating. I'll also say I think Paul found evangelism to be difficult. And so I find a great deal of comfort in that. When he wrote to the Corinthians, he said, I was with you with fear and much trembling. There's a place in Acts, I think it's in Acts chapter 18, where Paul was so fearful about stepping into Corinth that he had to have an angel come and reassure him, you're going to be okay. And so I just think, well, if Paul thought this is, if Paul stepped into this with fear and much trembling, all right, I bet there's good reason why this feels difficult. And there's also, can God use someone who's fearful and trembling? Yeah, I mean, he did it with Paul. So it just takes the onus off of me. I have to know the answers. I've got to do this the right way. Now, again, we want to do the best job that we can, but here, this is an important statement. I think I make it in this book. Our confidence is not in our confidence. Our confidence is in the power of the truth of the gospel, the power of God's word, the power of the Holy Spirit to draw people. It's not based on me. Again, I want to do the best job I can, but this whole thing ain't riding on me.
How do you encourage somebody from taking, which is great, going too far to the extreme of thinking that they have no responsibility, that someone else will do it, or that if it's all the Lord, he'll take care of it, I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. That some people do hold to that. If you really press people on it, I think they should find that it's hard to support that. I mean, we're told to go proclaim the gospel, go and make disciples, go preach the gospel. Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel, Paul said. There's that line of reasoning, I think it's in Romans 10. Well, how will they hear if unless someone is sent? And so, yes, God does the saving, but he has also determined the means. and the means are people talking to people. So sure, God is capable of appearing to people in a vision, and sometimes he does do that. But we have enough commandments that we are to be the proclaimers and the spokespersons. So how all that fits together, God's sovereignty and using human people, I'll let you answer that in your next sermon. I'm sure you could cover it rather quickly.
I appreciate that. I'd be curious, in your many years of researching Lewis, obviously Mere Christianity is a classic, the Chronicles of Narnia. Is there something that's maybe not quite as well known of Lewis's works that you would encourage a person who's curious about C.S. Lewis to also investigate?
I like that question. Well, my favorite of all of Lewis's books is the Screwtape Letters, and you learn a tremendous amount about the depth of our sin and the grace of the gospel by reading this fictitious set of letters from a senior demon to a young trainee. It's looking at the whole Christian life from the opposite perspective. You know, how do we mess up Christians? How should demons go about, keeping people away from God? So it's backwards and pretty evil. And so I don't know what that tells your listeners or you, that's my favorite of Lewis's books. By the way, there was in one introduction to one of his editions of that book where Lewis said, lots of people told me that I should keep writing more and more of these letters. And he said, while I never found the writing to be, I found the writing to be very easy to write, but deeply disturbing. And it wasn't very enjoyable. So that's why he didn't add more to it. So I think that's a very good book for how to live the Christian life. It's much more difficult to read than people think. You first start like, oh, this is a series of letters from a demon to a young demon. Oh, it's going to be funny. This is going to be fun. And you read the first page and you kind of smile a little bit. And by the time you get to page 3, you're going, oh, this is about me. This is, so it's a difficult book to read on that way. Other things of Lewis. Well, not everybody can get into this, but for some people, they get into it so much that it really helps them a lot. And it's the essay, it was really a sermon called The Weight of Glory. And it's one of the most helpful things for me. And I know some people who said, I tried to read that thing, I didn't understand a word of it. So I do realize that. But for some people, that whole argument that we're longing for some other world, and we get all of these hints of them in this world. That's a very powerful line of reasoning that has helped a lot of people like me. So I do recommend people try to give that a try, The Weight of Glory. And again, it's just one, I don't know, maybe it's 20 pages long or not even that long in a collection of essays.
Yeah, both those volumes are very near and dear to my heart. My wife absolutely loves the sermon, The Weight of Glory. And
good.
At the church a few weeks ago, we actually had somebody write kind of his own. It was like a one-act scene based off of the Screwtape Letters.
Nice.
He created a situation, and so it was a fun thing that we did at the church. And yeah, both great works from Lewis. As someone who has studied Lewis quite a bit, in researching for this book, was there anything that you learned about C.S. Lewis that was fascinatingly surprising to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people have asked me that question. I don't think there were any surprises, but the thing something that I don't think I appreciated anywhere near as much until I really dug into it was how Lewis engage the imagination as a way of drawing people toward the gospel, maybe without them even realizing it. The most common approach to apologetics and evangelism is, let me tell you some ideas. Let me tell you some truths that you need to know. Let me tell you propositional statements that you need to agree with. And yes, that's very important. But and Lewis did that. He did that. So it's not either or. But what he also did was he just created pictures for you to feel, what would it be like to become a Christian? What would it feel like? And he had all of these analogies that he wove in. He talked about becoming a Christian is like a rebel giving up their arms. It's like turning full speed astern. It's like a statue becoming a real person. I mean, he gave these imaginative pictures that you almost found yourself feeling something before you understood it, or the desire came before the comprehension. And that's an aspect of evangelism and preaching and all sorts of things that is just neglected. So that has changed the way I try to talk to people. I try to give these imagery and pictures. Here, let me give you one, because I think well, somewhere in the book I just list this whole big long list that Michael Ward put together, all these different analogies. It's like, a drowning man grabbing hold of a life preserver. It's one thing after another after another. But I think when we want to train people how to tell their story about how they became a Christian or why they're a Christian, we very often we tell it's a story with chronological events. Well, then I went to this and I heard this and I read this, and it's all very logical. And again, we need to include all that.
Sure.
But we also want to encourage people to give imagery that stimulates the desire and the heart. So I think I do tell this in the book. When my wife tells her story about how she became a Christian, she'll begin by saying, we've all heard about pirates who are searching for buried treasure, and they don't know where it is, but they know it's there. They've been told it's there. They know it's there, but they just don't know exactly where. And she said, that's what I was like when I stepped into college campus in my freshman year. I knew that there was something out there that I wanted to grasp, but I didn't know where to look. I didn't know where it was. So it was just like calling and drawing. And I think when she tells that story, people go, oh, I felt that. I have that kind of longing. So I think that's an aspect of Lewis that became much more prominent in my thinking after working on the book.
That's beautiful. One last question that I've thought about as you've been discussing Lewis, and obviously Lewis was a brilliant man in a variety of areas, and his ability to think concisely and clearly, his creativity, certainly he's a once in a generation, maybe once in many generations type of figure. And what encouragement would you have for somebody who looks at the evangelism approach of C.S. Lewis and thinks, but I'm not C.S. Lewis. Like I can't compete with that.
Right.
But why is it still helpful to maybe take a serious look at the things that Lewis did to evangelize and to incorporate that into our own practices of evangelism? Yeah,
good. That's a really good question, and I think it's a good one for us to end on. You said there was one more question, so yep. I'm going to hold you to that. Yes. So the first thing is, yes, I mean, Lewis was absolutely brilliant. He was a genius. he had a photographic memory. I mean, it's astonishing. But he chose to go out and speak in situations where people were not highly educated. And he found it to be a great challenge for him to say, how do I explain this to someone who's never going to take a class from me at Oxford? So he did a lot of presentations for the Air Force, people in the military. And when he was invited to do these radio broadcasts, he said, well, I don't know who's going to be listening. So I want to try to put my messages together so that anybody could understand this. So that's one piece of encouragement. The bigger piece is, you're right, there's nobody else who's like C.S. Lewis. And yeah, I think God raised him up in absolutely astonishing ways. But if we learn and study how the gospel has spread around the world, it's ordinary people having ordinary conversations about the extraordinary message of the gospel. It's not C.S. Lewis getting on the radio. It's the guy saying to his neighbor, hey, you want to come over to our house? We're going to be doing a Bible study, and maybe you might want to learn about something from the Bible. Or it's somebody saying to her neighbors, we're going to have this celebration next week of Easter. We're going to play all sorts of games, hide Easter eggs, and maybe you want to come over and have some dessert after dinner, and we're going to talk a little bit about what Easter means to us. So it's ordinary people doing those kind of things that are nowhere near as flashy and famous as C.S. Lewis getting on the BBC, but that's the way the gospel has spread for thousands of years.
Dr. Newman, thank you very much for joining me, and again, sharing your insights on Lewis and from your book, Mere Evangelism. I truly appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm really glad we got a chance to do this.